And now it's time for us to finish Chapter 7. Once we got to the street, we took off running. Or trying to run. Arthur and I were in front, Stacy right behind, with Ryan in his Levi's pouch. There was no time to think about what we might find between our house and Smiley's. We just took off. Covering those 3 blocks was like reliving my worst nightmare. It must have taken us 20 minutes to get to the corner of Sand Crane Drive and Fonda Way, a distance I've clocked at 1 minute 3 seconds on my bike, 2 minutes 4 seconds while running. Remember those dreams where you're frantically trying to get away from someone and you can't move? In mine, it's always these great hulking linebackers in black jumpsuits who all tackle me at once. They won't let go of my legs, so I have to keep dragging them along. I'm yelling and I'm screaming the whole time, but nobody ever comes to save me, and finally I wake up in a sweat just as they're ready to bash my brains out. That night, rain-soaked, shaken by thunder that rolled across the sky like kettle drums, I kept telling myself that this was another nightmare. Pretty soon I'd wake up and laugh because none of it was true, but I knew I was feeding myself a lie. The truth is just too terrible, that's all. Everything on Sand Crane Drive was destroyed, and getting to Smiley's place fast was exactly like trying to escape in a bad dream. All structures, houses, garages, fences, telephone poles have been leveled. The debris scattered helter-skelter. The only buildings still standing were a line of apartments several blocks away that we could see when lightning flashed. The trees on Sand Crane Drive were straight out of a nightmare, too. They looked like if some giant with big meaty hand had stripped the main branches and snapped off the rest. A few of the big trees had toppled clean over. Their shaggy root systems silhouetted against the electric sky looked like a landscape from a monster movie. There was no sign of Mom anywhere, or her silver Chevy Citation. Cars and trucks had been tossed about like toys up and down the Sand Crane, but hers wasn't one of them. We went a long time without stopping, stumbling, ducking things that were blowing loose. I fell a couple of times. We were so intent on sweeping both sides of the street with our lights, we sometimes crashed into each other in the dark. "Mom! Mom!" I tried yelling at first, but the wind shredded my words. She'd never hear me over that howling, spitting storm. Once my heart leaped. I thought I saw her. A figure caught on my light, someone thin, wearing jeans, hanging onto the back of the door of a van. When a man and a boy appeared, and I recognized Jason Miller from school. I knew the lady wasn't my mom, but his. They shone their light at us, and Jason's dad yelled, "Who is it?" We slowed, answered back. "Have you seen my mom?" I shouted. They looked at each other, shook their heads. Closer now, we could see they were inspecting their Miller's plumbing van that they had been slammed against a tree in their side yard. Jason, shirtless, flapping, appeared stunned at the sight of us running by. Until Stacy got hit in the face with what she thought was a flying shingle, we hardly stopped at all. Then we had to. We made her sit down on the curb so Arthur could inspect the welt rising on her cheek. But Stacy only pushed him away. "I'm okay, you guys, really," she insisted. Though she was blinking hard, I knew she was hurting. "I can take Ryan," I offered, as I gulped the air. "Do you want me to?" "No, he's fine." Stacy hooked her hair behind her ears, sniffling a little, then awkwardly got to her feet. She hitched the baby back in place again. "Look, Dan." She pulled me over. "Just look at him." I shone the light so I could see Ryan peeking out from inside her dad's jacket. He looked up at me so bright-eyed and solemn I just had to smile. "Isn't he something?" Stacy said with a grin. "I think he likes the ride." And then we were off again. When Arthur yelled a little later, "A person could get lost!" I knew what he meant. Without familiar landmarks, we'd long since lost track of who lived where. At last we reached the corner of Fonda Way and Sand Crane, only to find the intersection there strewn with litter of Aunt Goldie's house. All she had left was the bottom half of her yellow split level. Not even that. Part of the lower level had been sheared off, too. Maybe Goldie had lucked out, not being home when it happened. I had to remind myself that none of us had lucked out. Not that night. My heart was pounding so hard I leaped over the splintered wood covering Goldie's front yard. I stopped being careful by then, and was yelling for Mom once more. I couldn't get that picture out of my mind. Her flying through the air? Could she be buried somewhere? How would we know? Arthur trailed me, both of us leaving Stacy behind. Then I saw Mom's car, and my heart quit beating altogether. It was next door to Goldie's, in Miss Stevens' yard, a battered wreck wrapped in a length of chain-link fence. "Mom!" I screamed, clambering over everything to get to it. My hand shook wildly as I shone the light inside, over the back seat, across the floor. It was empty. Her purse lay on the front seat, covered with broken glass. "Mom! Mom!" I cried, but the wind whipped the words out of my mouth. Frantically, I started hauling stuff from under the car. Boards and bricks and chunks of siding, throwing them anywhere, digging and crying until I couldn't see. I had to find her. She could be trapped, dying. Arthur grabbed my arm from behind. "Come on, Dan," he yelled. "She made it to Smiley's. I know she did." I shook him off. I had to find her. I shook him off. I had to find her. Then the two of them got hold of me and pulled me away from the car. I kicked at Stacy, swore at Arthur, but they wouldn't let go. Arthur wrestled the light out of my hand, dragged me along beside him. I knew she was there, buried under that car. I knew it. I didn't want to go on Smiley's and waste all that time, but they wouldn't let go. I was so crazy right then, I didn't see the person in the red windbreaker who was hurrying towards us. "Look!" Stacy and Arthur shouted together. My mom's voice screaming, "Danny!" Seconds later, I was in my mother's arms, crying like a baby. Arthur and Stacy were crying too, but Mom and I were the ones making the most of the noise. You can't imagine how I felt right then. We all had our arms around each other next. Mom was kissing everybody, including Ryan, right through the denim jacket. I figured then that nothing else mattered. You can do without all kinds of things, your house, your bike, your room, a whole city of people if you have the other ones that you love. Stacy, Arthur, and I got into each other's way, trying to explain what it was like at our place in the Darlingtons, all over Grand Island, for all we knew. We snuffled and wiped our faces on our sleeves. Even Mom then smiled through our tears and hugged some more. It was really something. Suddenly, Mom noticed how wet I was and tried to get me to put her windbreaker on, but I wouldn't. I told her I was used to it, which wasn't anywhere near the truth. Right away, then she had to have Ryan, so Stacy gave him up and Mom started crying again once she had had him in her arms, saying how thankful she was that we were all alive. "What about Smiley?" Arthur asked. "Oh, poor Smiley," Mom said in a rush. "She's trapped downstairs in that house. I don't know how we're going to get her out." We huddled there as she told us about it, rain running down our faces into our mouths, all of us shaking. She'd taken Mrs. Smiley to the basement and was on her way back to the car, which she'd parked at Goldie's, having looked for her sister first, when she actually saw the tornado coming. She ran back to Smiley's, the funnel practically at her heels. She told us how she dived under the dining room table and held onto the legs as the storm raged on and on. I knew when the wind ripped off. I knew when the roof ripped off. I felt Mom shudder, but I didn't know until later that the back porch was gone too, collapsed onto the stairs. When it was over, I called and called, but I couldn't get Belle to answer. I thought she was going to cry again. I'm so worried about her. She could have had a heart attack down there, and who'd know? It was pitch black, and I couldn't get to her, so I started for home, but without a light, I had to go back. I began jumping around to warm up. My biggest worry right then was hypothermia. I was shaking so hard I couldn't stop. "How can we leave Smiley?" Arthur began. "Maybe with flashlights?" Stacy had gone out to the curb and was motioning and pointing. "Mrs. Hatch, couldn't we get some help down there? That's where we took the kids right after." Once in the street again, we could see lights and figures moving around a block or so beyond the Darlingtons' place. There was a bus, yellow, lights flashing, and what looked like a fire truck. Other headlights lit up the intersection. "Oh, thank God," Mom said. "Danny, I died 1,000 deaths." She didn't need to tell me. We put our arms around each other again. To think I'd almost left Ryan asleep in his room. I'd never tell her that. I reached across Mom and patted the warm round hump under the towel. Ryan Oliver. Saying his name almost choked me. I'd make sure he had the best big brother who ever lived. That's what I'd do. By the time we got to the pickup corner, past the sad hulk of the Darlingtons' house, an ambulance and a patrol car had arrived. The school bus was waiting to take people to Kmart, we were told. An emergency center had been set up there. With sirens going and red lights pulsing, the area reminded me of a disaster scene on TV for sure. The figures darting back and forth in the headlights turned out to be policemen, firemen, and Arthur's neighbors. A man got out on the bullhorn asking people to come out of their basements. Search and rescue was beginning, he said. He ticked off the dangers of staying, and there were plenty. When he was finished, Mom and Stacy tried to tell him about Mrs. Stanley, but it wasn't easy with everyone else pressing in for help. The officer nodded and listened. Naturally, none of us could think of her house number when he asked. About then, Evelyn's dad pushed into our circle. "We've got an injured woman over here. Need a couple of men. She's trapped." "Right." The officer swung around. "Don't worry," he called to Mom over his shoulder. We stood there and looked at each other, worrying more than ever. I could feel Mom shivering against me. The firemen had already begun searching houses, marking foundations afterward with red spray paint, but we knew for a fact that they wouldn't get to Smiley's for a long time. Neither would that police officer. "Hey, you forgot to tell them about the hearing aid," I said. "What if they call and she doesn't answer? They'll think nobody's there." Mom looked down at Ryan, who was starting to whimper. I knew by her face that she made up her mind to do something. "I'm going back," she said. "Stacy, you'll have to take the baby." "Let us go back," Arthur interrupted. "The three of us. Without Ryan along, we can be there in 5 minutes. What could you do by yourself anyway?" Suddenly, we were all talking at once. "I'd be crazy to send you kids. I got the boys out, Mrs. Hatch. I wouldn't let anything happen to them." "Please, Mom, we've got 2 flashlights. We can get there lots faster with those firemen who have to search every house along the way." "Absolutely not," she kept saying. Only after that the same officer got on the bullhorn asking for volunteers, and several people gathered around, did she finally give in. "Will you promise to stick together? And only to see Mrs. Smiley, you hear? No detour. Stacy, you bring them right back to this corner." She'd have kept on about how crazy it was for us to stay and not help her, but by then Ryan was crying. "The baby needs you most," Stacy said, throwing in the clincher. "Don't worry about us, Mrs. Hatch. We'll be okay." It was all very confusing for a few minutes as we got Mom and Ryan on the bus headed for Kmart. Mom had to take a message from Stacy to Mrs. Darlington, in case she ended up there and not at the armory, and messages from a few others who were staying behind to volunteer for help. At the end, Mom hugged us all again, right there in front of everybody boarding the bus. "I'm really proud of you kids, you know that?" She sniffled saying it, but she didn't cry. "Now please, please be careful, and stay with the others."
Why do I have less than 16 problems such as
"I'm really proud of you kids, you know that?" She sniffled saying it, but she didn't cry. "Now please, please be careful, and stay with the others." She gave me an extra muzzle on the neck. "Oh, Mom," I said, "you don't need to get all mushy." She cuffed me one as I turned and fled.